Alistair Glendon bolts through the dimly lit hallways of Site-19, pursued by an avalanche of oozy flesh. He has to keep running for the sake of his purpose, his revenge. He cannot slow down the mass. He cannot destroy it either. But if luck is on his side this day, he just might escape its grasp. The monster's tendrils reach for him, and he ducks away in the nick of time, missing him by mere inches. He'd seen so many others go out the same way, but not him. The monster gibbers insanely behind him, all the same nonsense about unity and togetherness. It's enough to drive you to the brink. He keeps running, legs pumping, lungs aching. These monsters never get tired. He needs a distraction. That's when he sees a fire extinguisher on the wall. Perfect. Alistair draws on some hidden reserve of energy, lunging forward and ripping the extinguisher off the wall with adrenaline-fueled strength. He throws it into the fleshy mass, and in an action better measured in milliseconds, whips out his revolver and fires off 2 shots. The first misses. The second hits the extinguisher just as planned. Boom. The creature shrieks and retreats for a moment in the confusion, and is wounded by shrapnel and fire from the blast. Alistair steals these few seconds to run ahead and widen his lead. There's no point in just shooting the monster. He needs those bullets for something else. Both Dr. Alistair Glendon and his world had become a shadow of their former selves. The sun in the sky, once a source of life and warmth, was now an indiscriminate corrupter of flesh. Alistair never thought he'd see the world in such a state, and even thought that he was the one who could save it was a notion that eluded him. It was beyond anything that anyone could do at this point. Though at one time, he had been associated with the only people who might have prevented it before it got this far. The SCP Foundation. Maybe there were still secrets the organization left behind that could protect him in this world. Since the dawn of this new cataclysmic age, an event that the experts in Alistair's field called SCP-001 When Day Breaks, the surface of the world had become inhabited by monstrous mutations of the creatures that used to dwell on it. These twisted amalgamations of tissue were best avoided, especially as they grew in size, slowly coalescing into a singular life form. It seems for a moment that he might just be in the clear, as the shocked monster lags behind him, until he sees the ceiling panel shift above him just a few feet ahead. Oh no. A horrid mass of flesh spools out of the ceiling, giggling like a schoolgirl and forming a mass onto the ground. Alistair's cornered. There's a monster on either side of him getting closer. He needs to think fast, or he'll die again right here. This proximity to death reminds him of what happened before. Those dark, terrible memories trapped in the endless maze with black slime dripping down the walls. He'd wandered that awful place for 1,000 years, bones and broken glass crunching beneath his bare feet. That terrible grin, rotten and crooked teeth floating in the dark. Feeling fear beyond measure day after day after day. Dr. Alistair Glendon had been tortured to death once, and for reasons he didn't understand until recently, he'd been pulled back to the moral coil in the least relieving way imaginable, thrust into a world almost like the one he'd remembered, but broken and terrible. One thing was for sure though, he was not going to die again. Not in this hallway. Not to these pathetic beings. He ponders for half a moment how thick the drywall is, then does something insane. He throws his shoulder into it, the full weight of his body behind him, and smashes through the wall, landing in what seems like a break room in a cloud of plaster dust. The room is filthy and filled with skeletons clutching weapons. Empty tins of food lay around everywhere. They must have starved in here. No time to mourn. The monsters don't hesitate. They see the hole in the wall and start slithering in behind him, chittering and cooing. He sees that one of the skeletons is clutching a P-90 submachine gun, standard issue for a lot of the tactical guards. He can only hope it still has ammo as he wrenches it from the skeletal hand of one of his dead former Foundation compatriots. The creatures are in the room now, reaching out, hoping to take him, absorb him, consume him. But they won't eat him. They'll eat lead. Alistair squeezes the trigger and unleashes hell, unloading into the twisted masses, causing them to recoil in shock. Click. The magazine is empty. He does not hesitate, just throws the gun at his pursuers and runs for the nearest door, bursting out into the hallway and confining his charge into the bowels of the facility. Even after all of this, the monsters still give chase. They are relentless. The researcher tore through Site-19, making every tight turn and ascending every steep staircase in an effort to use the flesh mass's viscous inevitability against it. Before long, he reached a reinforced security door that was sealed shut. For a man without credentials, this blocked portal might as well been a solid wall. Dr. Alistair Glendon was not that man, so he searched his pockets for a level 3 security access card he knew was somewhere on his person. He could hear the slithering behind him. The insane chants. Were there more of them now? They hunted in packs when they weren't fused, outgunning, outnumbering, always hunting, getting closer. He could see their shadows down the hall as he desperately fumbled in his pocket for the keycard with sweaty fingers. Come on, come on, come on! They were getting closer, only feet away now. He could feel that awful warmth that came off their bodies as their masses filled the hallway behind him. Got it! The door's security panel made a buzzing noise of approval, and the entrance slid open with sudden efficiency. Dr. Glendon dove through the opening and struck a button on the other side, sealing the blob of slime on the other side. A thunderous slam of flesh against metal reverberated all around him. Alistair knew that the door could not hold forever, and that some of the daybreak flesh amalgamations may even find another way of reaching him. But he kept on moving so as not to waste the time that had been bought for him. Dr. Glendon would never let such misshapen lumps of corrupted flesh take him down, not here in this place so far from his goal. He knew that Site-19 was not the destination of his journey, but if he played his cards right, it would become the true beginning. Come what may, he could not die until fate gave him the weapons necessary to face his deadly foe. By some miracle, it seemed as though he had entered the most secure part of Site-19, the research cells. The only way back out into the world would be through the door that he had previously sealed. If he couldn't find some anomalous or non-anomalous way to fight through the mutated flesh monsters of the daybreak, then he could never hope to traverse the apocalyptic wasteland in the world above. Here in the research cells, Dr. Alistair Glendon was being given a golden opportunity to arm himself with the fruits of his fallen organization's knowledge. The SCP Foundation may or may not have endured the events of the ultimate anomaly, SCP-001, but from the ashes, Dr. Alistair Glendon would rise like a dark phoenix of vengeance. Everything he possibly needed was right here. Alistair walked down the corridors of the research cells until he found the telltale signs of one particular chamber that read 019-B. If all things were ordinary, this cell would have been watched over by a pair of armed guards, but this was obviously no longer the case. Whether they had been deployed elsewhere or merely fled, the doorway was unguarded, save for another secure lock that Dr. Glendon could use his card to get through. SCP-914? What was that one again? Alistair tried to remember. Site-19 had not been his station during the height of his career, and it had been quite some time since he had set foot in it. Whatever it was, the number stood out to the avenging doctor as being significant. He unlocked the door using his card and entered the room. Inside was a massive clockwork device, inert at the moment, but equipped with hundreds of interlocking gears of all shapes and sizes. There was something impossibly timeless about the construction of the machine. The Clockworks, or SCP-914, were considered a safe class SCP, but the application of their function could lead to any number of fascinating outcomes. Vague memories of research data that Alistair had read within a document began to flood back into the forefront of his mind. He now knew what SCP-914 was capable of, but operating it correctly would come down to chance. Or so he thought. A familiar voice echoed from a dark corner of the room, and Dr. Glendon turned his head to behold his fellow high-level researcher, Dr. Gears. Known to his closest colleagues as COG, the cool-headed Dr. Gears was a specialist in Euclid-class SCPs, that is to say, objects with unpredictable but not entirely hostile anomalous qualities. Good to see that you've arrived here in one piece, Alistair. You'll have to forgive me for thinking you were dead, said Gears. Alistair was about to say the same, but then he noticed with some alarm that Dr. Gears hadn't moved from his spot in the shadows. He took a few steps towards Dr. Gears and realized the man he knew had undergone some strange sort of metamorphosis. The body of Dr. Gears was partially clockwork itself now, and within the joints of his limbs and the surface of his skin were the same interlocking gears that had defined the aesthetic of SCP-914. Dr. Glendon could only look on in amazement. Dr. Gears confessed that, with the help of SCP-914, he'd gone the way of the Mechanites, a group of interest whose religious beliefs had pushed them to abandon flesh entirely. He didn't need to eat. He didn't need to sleep. He was a living, half-clockwork perpetual motion machine. Dr. Glendon drank in the staggering implications of what Dr. Gears said to him, realizing the obvious explanation almost immediately. SCP-914 was a matter enhancement device with the anomalous ability to refine whatever was placed inside of it into a new and improved form. It had long since been under the care of Dr. Gears, whose devotion to researching the machine itself bordered on his entire personality. What had taken place here was a reward for his service. It was apparent that Dr. Gears had tried to make himself immune to the effects of SCP-001 by mechanizing himself, but the anomalous effects of SCP-914 had not been enough. He had achieved a transcendence of sorts from the human form and would likely be able to continue on living indefinitely, but the curse that lingered in the world above did not make the prospect of that very appealing. But Dr. Gears wasn't the only one who wanted a change. Alistair was here for a reason. He needed to transform, to become something so much more powerful, to survive this new world and claim his vengeance. You know the risks, Dr. Gears said. It was not a question. You may not like what you become, Alistair. That much he already knew. Dr. Gears nodded. He gestured with one robotic limb toward the input chamber of the Clockworks, bidding that Dr. Glendon enter. Dr. Gears would set the machine to the very fine setting, the setting guaranteed to produce an utterly unpredictable result. Dr. Alistair Glendon was reluctant at first, but he contemplated his options. There was no going back to the world as it was, and his current non-anomalous body would not be enough to achieve his goals. This was a crossroads, and if he had any luck left, it could be a reward for him as well. He agreed to step into the machine, and soon the process of refinement had begun. It was a strange sensation to be deconstructed and reconstituted in a new shape, but it was not something that Alistair was entirely a stranger to. In the liminal darkness between dreams, Dr. Glendon felt everything unessential be stripped away from him. He was not a machine like Dr. Gears, but he would soon be as efficient as one at fulfilling his goal. There was a great darkness around him, and while Alistair couldn't fathom if it was in his mind or the truth of his surroundings, in seconds, all discrepancies between the two no longer mattered. This dark was real and was consuming him. No, it was him. He was the darkness. It had come from him. His body fused with shadow, irrevocably changing him into something inhuman. His skin became knotted with black veins. He now looked like a monster. But sometimes you need to become a monster to stop a monster. Make a friend of the dark to defeat the light. In the old world, he would probably be contained for fear of his newfound anomalous capabilities. The old him might have even agreed. That man was dead. Only his shadow lingered. As Dr. Glendon returned to existence on the other side of the Clockworks, he emerged from SCP-914 with a level of power incomparable to the feeble man he once was. He felt remarkably distant from his human body, as if it were only a vessel to contain all the darkness that he had fused into his soul. He turned to look at Dr. Gears, but as his eyes beheld the state of the room, he was treated to a ghastly sight that would have turned his stomach if it weren't one with the shadows now. It was them. The daybreak oozes had breached the door, and more than that, they were in the cell now. "Dr. Gears, no!" Alistair cried out. It was the only vestige of weakness left to expunge from himself. Though the terror he felt was real and present thing, even as it turned to anger and murderous rage. A horrible feast was happening right before his eyes. The slimy amalgamation of formerly independent organisms were already devouring Dr. Gears, incorporating the researcher into its prodigious mass. Dr. Gears' mechanical parts were hanging on to his dwindling sapience, but without the flesh parts to sustain them, all of Dr. Gears would soon be gone. Dr. Glendon balled up both his fists and cried out in fury. But it wasn't just the ones swallowing Gears. They were everywhere, perhaps attracted by the noise of the Clockworks in action. The whole facility was crawling with giant, fleshy sun worshippers, intent on dragging any last forces of resistance into the killing light. Within the next second, Dr. Gears' remaining flesh had vanished into the blob, and his lifeless machine parts clattered to the floor of the research cell. Dr. Alistair Glendon felt the rage bubbling within his chest, and as simply as he breathed, he began to arrange the shadows around him. If I cannot live in the light, I will thrive in the dark. His hand shot forward, and a wall of shadow pushed back the incoming ooze. It was solid, perhaps even impenetrable. This was his ability, his anomalous gift by the inner workings of SCP-914, and the very edge that he would use to strike down that man. He was one with the shadows now, and he could use that as a shield, or even a deadly weapon. The shadows shifted again with a clenching of Dr. Glendon's fist. Thousands of tiny, grating blades formed a dense texture on the external surface of the dark shape and began to rotate as freely as the air itself. It was a weapon lighter, sharper, and more widespread than any that could exist through solid matter. Not even a hail of bullets could deal damage so quickly, and the outcome of the shadow attack was the utter annihilation of all slime that it came in contact with. With the power of shadow on his side, Dr. Alistair Glendon ripped through the fleshy mass as if he were in possession of 1,000 buzzsaws all spinning at once. He strode forward now, confident that each step he took would bring him closer to freedom from Site-19. Alistair had no qualms about reducing the matter down to the smallest scraps as he made his triumphant return to the surface. Though the sun of the daybreak was still as powerful in its effects as ever, the dome of shadows that now surrounded Alistair meant that he could remove his headgear without worry of being affected. He strode onward and away from Site-19, content for now in the knowledge that he was making progress towards his revenge. He would find that man, the one who brought him to this terrible hell on Earth. But before he could have his vengeance, he would need to endure so many more terrible, terrible things. Now go check out SCP-001 When Day Breaks, SCP-682, and SCP-914 What Did You Put In for more.